Hello, and welcome to episode 205 of Prose.
This week, let's take another foray into the world of Ash and Bone with Rowan and see his side of the story, and come visit the post-apocalypse world with me. I hope that you all go and follow the show on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, as this can help the podcast get noticed. But I truly beg of you, even more, to head over to Apple Podcasts, aka iTunes, and leave a rating and or review for Prose. Ratings and reviews set this show up for continuing on well into the future. For easiest access to the show, subscribe using Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or whatever podcast catcher is your favorite. You could also do the show a huge solid if you will continue recommending it to family and friends that might enjoy the program. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tale, shall we? This week we have Charred and the Whimper. Enjoy. The Whimper, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Even in death, we couldn't get it right. We were all dead. That was for sure, but we just weren't lying down and giving up. We weren't sleeping our long-earned sleep of the after. The trees were withered. The skies were a perpetual gray. The one massive star keeping the solar system alive, only barely being able to punch through the silt and fallout from the wars. No, not nuclear strikes or orbital striking measures. Our war had been on ourselves for centuries, since the first coughs and starts of the Industrial Revolution, really. As soon as we began trying to blot out the stars with our fumes and smokes and our own set of lights to rival the heavens, well, that was the beginning of the end now, wasn't it? What's funny is that the new world, the end of the world, the changed world, no matter what you called it, this world wasn't all that different from the one that we had in place, and that was so familiar and precious to us. The poor and weak worked harder than the rich and powerful. The rich and powerful exploited the poor. There were haves and have-nots. However, what was precious was far different now from what it had been. The trivialities of yesteryear became laughable. Potable water was precious. A day where the sun broke through just a little bit more was precious. A spring of green popping up somewhere or other was precious. A baby making it out from between their mother's legs alive was very, very precious indeed. One thing was to be said for the world striking back against we members of its collective sickness. The toxicity spewing and flowing cruelly into her veins was stopped short almost immediately. Nature began to reclaim her dominion that was so long ago usurped. Even with this resurgence of the natural world, things were not as they were. The flora that began to creep and crawl into the old spaces we had once filled were not kind or beautiful or edible. The plants that survived in the horrific perpetual twilight were mean and hard and thorny and inhospitable. They were gray and muted and not the plants that yesteryear's books and memories held. They were clearly aggressive toward we survivors, we sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, that had so long ago abandoned our care of and for them. Eden had long ago fallen, but this was whatever its opposite might be. The occasional prickly pear made for a painfully earned treat, but most plants were inaccessible. Fauna was all but unheard of anymore. Though, even this far inland, I heard tales of a once proud fishing village that still clung to the all but disappeared coastline, catching a whale of sorts. It was bulging and mutated, clearly spoiled and rotting from the inside out. Still, those desperate men and women guarded that abomination day and night, hoping that the ruined Leviathan might provide them with enough substance to move on for a few more days. Weeks even, depending on how quickly the rot inside and the rot outside collaborated. The tale of that beast very well might be fiction, though. Anymore, stories of hope and success generally were. It was the small things, though, that were the largest shift for most of us. Time disappeared. Clocks were just irrelevant. Moreover, even the concept of what constituted a day shifted as the world rebelled against its foreman. At what might have been sunrise, it was dim, gray, and somewhat lit. At what might have been high noon, it was dim, gray, and somewhat lit. At what might have been dusk, it was dim, gray, and somewhat lit. At what might have been midnight, strangest of all, the world was, indeed, still dim, gray, and somewhat lit. Never-ending liminal times that one could not gauge or measure. Hours bled into days, and within what at least felt like a short amount of time, we had lost track of how long it had been since those major changes in the world had even begun. We spoke of the change as if it had been decades ago, centuries. But we knew full well that none of us were like the biblical patriarchs and matriarchs of old. It could have only been a handful of years, but each year became a century in this limbo. Most of us cannot recognize ourselves anymore. Our lives have been burned away, scorched into oblivion by the heat and the drought and the cold and the schizophrenic weather that was our daily life now. Our faces and bodies, though, were just as drastically altered by this change. Suddenly, even the strongest were weaker than our weakest once were, though they dominated those that were weaker yet. Everyone you came into contact with had hollow cheeks, hollow eyes, hollow bellies, divots near their hips and in their thighs, sharp, angular faces gaunt with varying degrees of hunger, assorted types of disease, and pervasive, unending worry are the new norm. Clear skin, nice pecs, tanned glows, bright eyes, large breasts, swollen biceps, red lips. Those were now so distant and so foreign that seeing old magazines featuring disturbed magnifications of those standards of beauty seemed comical to us. We laughed at these show pony people, at their comfort and their naivete to think that beauty was truth and truth was beauty. We knew that there was so much more to know on this earth and in this life. What was beautiful was a fire with our scant few neighbors around. We were still too civilized to call them tribes just yet. What was beautiful was an unpunctured can of Spam and a bottle of undistorted ketchup. Such a feast was becoming rarer and rarer, and increasingly a find like that might draw the wrong sort of attention. What was beautiful was cleaving to those few you loved while you still could. Most of us had lost loved ones in the changes. Mom, Dad, Aunt Jessie, Uncle Benjamin, all my cousins. So those happy few we had left made for the best sort of company, the best means of preserving something that resembled sanity and normalcy. The desire for that normalcy was there. But between the spasms of our failing bodies, the potency of the hellish existence we had wrought, the putrid essence of our past lives that lingered in the air mockingly, and the shadow that was even still growing on our metaphorical and literal horizon, well, our earthly kingdom would soon be eyeless and silent. Waking death, our new reality. Thank you for listening to The Whimper. The backing track for this story was taken from the Free Music Archive and is by Fleshlit. The track is titled Girls and is among a great many amazing works that the artist has available on the Free Music Archive. The track is being used under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. Thank you to Fleshlit and the Free Music Archive for giving the world access to this amazing track. Next up, please stick around for another side to the world we began dabbling in last week's story titled Before the Fall. This week's continuance in that world is titled Charred, and will mark a possible extended world being born right here on Prose. Let's go leap back into the realm of Mina and Rowan. Charred, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Rowan Penn Warren's stomach lurched and danced at the smell of roasted meat. He could hear it sizzling not 10 feet away by one of the thousands of campfires that contributed to his army's sprawling winter camp. He moved to walk farther from the fire, closer to the wood line that the men and women of his forces were so unnerved by, despite their numbers and their weapons and their savagery. It had been years since he had last eaten meat. He honestly could not remember when the last time actually was. Rowan did know, however, that the smell of gristle cracking and bone splitting with the kiss of a roasting fire was too much for him to handle anymore. He chuckled to himself. Butcher of the Beswain, Mina and her followers called him. He couldn't kill a lamb to literally save his life from starvation. But could he ever tear an entire village asunder, shredding their flesh and boiling their blood? Rowan stopped when he reached the tree line. He had traversed nary half a mile in the time it took him one reminiscence and one thought. Losing time was becoming all too common these days, and he could not have that happening on the eve of battle. He chuckled to himself again. Soter the Savior, the peoples of this ruined world and his followers called him. He sent men and women by the thousands to their deaths over the span of his time as Soter. He wondered how salvation was treating them and their rotted corpses off in far-flung fields and valleys and river basins. Butcher or savior? Savior or butcher? A matter of perspective, was it not? He himself could not answer the query, though. Not truly. He thought what he was doing was right, but doesn't every man and every woman that ever lifted a blade ever fought their fellow man? He did know that he was no Messiah. He'd not been born of any goddess or nymph. He'd not been raised in the underworld or astride the northern pillars with the gods or demons. He was a simple farm boy that just so happened to see the patterns of the world. The woven tapestry of how this simple existence on this terra firma came together and was shaped in its entirety. Maybe that sight beyond others was what made him Soter the Savior. It was certainly what made him the Butcher of the Biswain. There had been at least 50 men rushing him there at the banks of the Biswain. With a word and some blood and a thought, Rowan had shredded them like the good wives of his old village used to do with sickly, stringy rabbit before putting it into the communal stew. Ribbons and flaps tore away from those men and women's bodies. An eyeball exploded here, a cheek was taken off there. A nose imploded into a woman's face, her golden white hair showing the bright red of the caving in, acting as a blank canvas for his beautiful work. He ended those 50 right then and there. He disarticulated them in the passage of a moment. But they did not share their food. They did not share their beds. They still held to the belief that knowledge was some devilry that would damn the soul and ruin the already miserable and cursory half-life that the entire human race was already living. The forgetting had taken the people of the world, already broken and cowed in the wake of their poor decisions, and made them ignorant on top of it. Ignorant to their heritage, to their potential, to their birthright. Rowan sighed. He was getting worked up, and that always brought on the same thought. Mina Dinjena Nesiandren. He had loved her once. He thought he might love her still. How could two people be destined to be together while being so clearly doomed to oppose one another until they drew their last ragged breath, dying at the hands of the other? Mina had been with him as he discovered his powers. Back then, he ate meat. He would always go out of his way to get the best skewer for her, taking the charred or the slightly off-looking skewer for himself. She was his queen, even in childhood, long before he knew what he was supposed to feel toward young women and why. He would have her be his queen now. She tempered his fury. She always had. She challenged his boundaryless ways of thinking, helping him remember his own humanity and what it is like to be small and hopeless in a world almost entirely devoid of light. Mina Dinjena Nesiandren was everything he loved about this world, and here he was pointing legions of rabid men and women following Soter the Savior at her and those she loved. Tomorrow, he would seek to have her dead. He would unleash his godlike power at and, if possible, on her, charring her bones and heating her innards until they bubbled like the hot springs of a Sheem they had visited together a lifetime ago. Something moved out in the woods. Something enormous. Rowan Penwarren Conleandra, the Butcher of the Biswain, Soter the Savior, a man, turned back to the camp and began walking toward the consumption of the dead, the smell of cooking animal flesh growing stronger as he trudged away from the dangerous wood and toward the relative safety of the lit martial camp. His stomach began to roil again. All that meat smelled like victory. All that meat smelled like what Mina must tomorrow if he hoped to remake the world into something better. Men and women continued butchering more sheep to keep the food coming to the army, and Rowan bathed in the death, allowing that blood to fuel his magical stores for his coming battle against the only person he truly had ever loved. Thank you for listening to Charred, a short story in an ever-growing world created by me, Jared I. McGee. If you'd like a little bit more of the story, please harken back to episode 61's Ash and Bone, where the world is introduced. Do note that the characters' names have changed. Rowan Penn Warren was first named Jensen, and Warren Penn Uther was first named Oren Feinhold. Additionally, if you are enjoying this world, be sure to tune in the coming weeks to hear more of their adventures. With only 2 exceptions, all noises and musical tracks in the background of this story are from freesound.org. The sounds and musical tracks are being used under CC 0.1.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. The exceptions are the 2 musical compositions which come from Free Music Archive. The first track is titled Lost Star and is by Gelsonic, an artist whose work has featured prominently in early Prose episodes. This track comes from his album Various Moods, a 2015 release by Gelsonic. This track is being used under an Attribution 4.0 International CC BY 4.0 license. For more music by Gelsonic, go to the Free Music Archive or directly to gelsonic.com. The second track is titled Red Danube and is by Lee Rosevear. This track is being used under an Attribution 4.0 International CC BY 4.0 license. For more music by Mr. Rosevear, also go to the Free Music Archive or really any number of other web music services, including YouTube. That does it for Prose this week. Again, I will ask that you all do please share the podcast with a friend. And as always, I hope that you'll remember to love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is, always, stranger than fiction. Thank you for listening and see you next time.